Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to Writing on Games. Metal Gear stories have always left people asking questions. It's basically common knowledge at this stage that with their labyrinthine plots drawing from decades of lore, layered characters, links between various organisations both real and fictional, all topped off with a penchant for the supernatural, that you won't have a full grasp of a Metal Gear Solid game your first time playing it. What is also understood, however, is that with enough time, repeat playthroughs, and research, you can begin to wrap your head around these narratives and the bigger questions they ask of you, no matter how convoluted their actual plots may initially seem. Metal Gear Solid had players questioning what it meant to attach one's sense of worth to their lineage, how to define one's own path in life when our destinies are seemingly written in our genes. Sons of Liberty took this in a more meta direction, forcing players to consider more nebulous mimetic qualities, the things that turn our flesh and bones, or in this case pixels, into what we know as the human. Snake Eater and Peace Walker, even with their slightly more grounded spy thriller narratives, still had players asking, what do we mean by loyalty, patriotism? Again, what does it mean to take hold of your own destiny when there are seemingly all these forces at play out with your control? These are complex questions on the nature of existence that don't have simple answers. By comparison, however, as I dove further into my recent playthrough of Metal Gear Solid 5, the only questions I found myself asking were: why doesn't Quiet just write something down to avoid being tortured? Why does she not just ask Code Talker to translate considering they share a common tongue? Why is Code Talker here? How do the vocal parasites deal with languages that share words? How do they differentiate between someone saying no in English and no in Spanish and no in Italian?
Why am I still playing this game?
All of this is to say that while my last video on the Phantom Pain's gameplay systems proved somewhat divisive, I don't think I'm making a particularly controversial statement when I say that the story in Metal Gear Solid 5 is severely lacking. Even if the story wasn't so visibly unfinished, you have major plot holes, contextless missions, and dramatic missteps in characterization, hindering what is, by franchise standards, a remarkably dull series of events, all in service of a twist that, while it had potential, doesn't tell us much that we didn't already know. For a game set to conclude a franchise that arguably helped establish games as a storytelling medium, for all the promises that were made as to how this game would fill in the missing link of the series, how Big Boss supposedly became the big baddie, it really served to do none of that, acting as the least interesting way to tell a story that didn't need to be told. Perhaps the most important problems the story faces, however, where all the other problems stem from, are structural. Much like the Phantom Pain's mechanics attempt to heighten player expression through a more open design, its story seems to want to do something similar, placing emphasis on emergent player-driven narratives within gameplay, rather than the linear, overarching yarns that became a staple of older titles. As opposed to having one main mission from which the wild, brain-melting drama ensues, the Phantom Pain tries to focus each smaller mission as something of a vignette, as evidenced by the credits that begin and end every sortie. Gone are the codec calls of past games, those moments where you would be pulled out of the action to watch a mostly static screen with talking heads expositing at one another. You know, those moments that said, yeah, we have more story to tell, sure, but we're not gonna animate cutscenes for every single narrative beat. In their place, we find cassette tapes dumped on you at the end of missions, functionally similar to the codec, but you choose to listen to them as and when you like, or if you feel like, totally ignore them throughout your entire playthrough. Given that Kojima has faced extensive criticism over the years for his reliance on overwritten dialogue and lengthy non-interactive cutscenes, these moves towards a more open, player-driven style of storytelling make sense, on paper at least. In practice, however, they serve as testament to the fact that there's a reason game stories tend to be told linearly. It feels like the Phantom Pain can't tell what it really wants to be. The methods of storytelling favoured here come at the direct cost of the overarching narrative the game is still trying to tell, resulting in an unstructured, unfocused mess. In much the same way the gameplay has you micromanaging Mother Base and elements of Snake's character outside of main missions, the Phantom Pain sees Snake's attention being drawn in multiple different directions at once. The team's desire to get revenge on those responsible for the attack on Mother Base 9 years prior is intercut with the day-to-day running of Diamond Dogs. Snake is trying to find out exactly who was responsible for the attack, doing jobs for various clients to build the profile of his oil rig without a nation, he's rescuing child soldiers, he's trying to thwart vocal parasites that threaten to eradicate the English language, he's having to manage outbreaks of said parasites on his base, he's trying to weed out Cypher spies from the ranks, he's trying to stop nuclear weapons. In short, like the players, Snake is doing a bit of everything. And when you have to account for all of these plates spinning at once, while also juggling the possibility that players might have chosen to ignore the myriad of tapes dumped on them, and therefore any means of contextualizing these events, it becomes immensely difficult as a writer to focus that narrative. In previous games, things like linearly placed codec calls provided that focus, but it wasn't like those older games were always easily understood or even free from plot holes. I mean, this is the series that created a meme out of nanomachines. Even at their most straight ahead, you still had 60s spy thriller tropes running up against supernatural anime nonsense, with talk of the philosophers and immortal beings and patriotism and bees and the like. But the way those stories were told allowed Kojima to direct your focus towards one specific thing at any given time. You had one mission, whether it be establishing the enemy's nuclear strike capability, rescuing the president, killing your mentor, etc. Events would spiral from there, but thanks to things like codec conversations to provide context, there existed a traceable logic to the way events played out. Character motivations and overarching themes were clearly established. Smaller subplots emerging as a result of the main plot would contribute to the larger themes of that plot. Generally, things made some kind of sense. The open-ended, less structured nature of the Phantom Pain, on the other hand, makes it difficult to pin down what exactly the main theme or even the main plot is here. Is it the revenge plot against Skullface? Is it the vocal parasites? Is it the story of Quiet struggling with her conflicting feelings towards Snake? I mean, that story arc concludes with one of 3 separate credit sequences suggesting a particular kind of importance. What about the main themes? Is it the dangers of nuclear warfare? Language? The cyclical nature of revenge? That using child soldiers is bad? We don't know because the game's story isn't coherently told. These aren't questions on the nature of existence or whatever. It's trying to figure out, on a basic level, what it is this game is trying to say. Let me give you an example of this in practice. Metal Gear Solid is a game that managed to get you feeling all kinds of things about a cyborg ninja that appeared seemingly out of nowhere, using carefully placed codec conversations to eke out the details of said ninja's relationship with every character as soon as Snake realizes it's Grey Fox. Over the course of the game, you get hints of his tragic backstory, as well as Naomi's, contextualizing both his presence and Naomi's thirst for revenge, all building up to an immensely poignant conclusion. A mixture of anger, sadness, confusion, regret, as well as catharsis. We witness a character with a true arc, attempting to atone for his past actions even if it requires him to pay the ultimate price. And what's more, this encounter further energizes Snake to finish the fight. It's a neatly paced little story that ends up bolstering the larger plot rather than distracting from it. It's the micro seamlessly defining the macro. Now imagine if that arc had played out in the style of the Phantom Pain. You would receive a side op called Investigate Ninja or something daft like that. Fox would approach a silent, expressionless Snake very slowly, with a brief flash revealing someone's face, before cutting back to Snake, still silent and expressionless. He'd then get to the fight with Rex, only for it to stop halfway through as that ninja from before jumped in out of nowhere and got killed. Maybe Snake would say, "No," as a ninja we don't know gave a speech. Then the battle would proceed as normal. You'd likely think, wait, what? Who the hell was that? Before realizing that all the necessary context was inelegantly buried in there somewhere, forcing you to comb through lists of Mei Ling proverbs and Nastasha Romanenko telling you about the Nikita missile launcher to get to Grey Fox's origins number 8 and scroll down to Naomi Hunter's reasoning number 4 or who that ninja was number 9 or whatever. You might say, well, the important tapes are highlighted yellow, so they're easy to distinguish from the more optional information. To that I would say, why not just automatically play them during missions as you spend minutes at a time running from place to place, as opposed to having me navigate these lists to decide which ones were worth sticking on for a punt. You constantly have Ocelot chiming in over the story tapes, by the way, about plants you're picking up or telling you about enemy gunships. Why not have him provide you with the context for the mission you're actually on? Otherwise, for a great deal of the missions in the game, you have Kaz tell you, a client asked us to do this in the helicopter, followed by a near static screen at the end of a mission telling you why that person you rescued will be useful on Mother Base or something. Also though, some plot holes like the ones I mentioned at the start aren't acknowledged in the yellow tapes. If you go to the vocal cord parasite's learning ability within vocal cord parasites number 3, you can hear Code Talker discuss the problems of different dialects within the same language, for example. But it's displayed as if it were merely supplemental, as opposed to a necessary question this pretty significant plot point demands. And even then, the tape doesn't clear up the problem per se, it just kind of mentions it, saying, oh yeah, the eggs can listen to their host to pick up dialects, and also they aren't perfect I guess, and you can't blame me for that. It's quiet breathed through her skin levels of daft. Kojima is that kid who throws a tantrum in a game of tag saying, that didn't count because I had an invisible force field the entire time. Kojima has been known to retcon previous events in older games to further expand on those events in later titles. This is seemingly the first time he's had to re-examine events within the same game in order to have basic plot points make even the remotest bit of sense. And then there's Chapter 2. I stated in my first video that despite its reuse of older missions, this section ended up being some of the most fun I had in my second playthrough, due to the fresh challenges imposed on you. In a storytelling sense, however, it feels weird to even call it a chapter. If this were a book, it would have you reading old sections again almost verbatim before giving you a smidgen of new information that really wasn't worth the effort it took to get there. Narratively, these missions aren't recontextualized even slightly. You get told by Kaz that some new jobs came in before somehow transporting yourself back to the helicopter ride with Code Talker, who you've just met for the first time, so that you can crash again and get back into the Skulls fight for no reason. The workarounds here wouldn't have had to be world-alteringly complex. For a mission like C2W where you're destroying communications arrays, just have Kaz say, hey, remember those dishes you destroyed? They rebuilt them, go get them again. Peace Walker did that exact thing in order to justify you returning to previous environments. Why not here? Either that, or maybe pick less story-specific missions to replay, because God knows there's a whole lot of main ops that don't matter one jot to the overarching narrative. Chapter 2 would have always angered fans looking for all new content regardless, but it would have at the very least made some amount of sense. Instead, we have a scenario that seems to line up with the stories of the game's production. Namely, that the resources needed to produce all new content or sufficiently recontextualize older missions ran out long before the game could be considered finished. Seriously, to say the Phantom Pain is a disjointed, marked step down from the quality of other games would be an understatement. Remember those incredible story trailers shown prior to the game's release? Not only do they show the majority of the game's few noteworthy cutscenes, they also evoke a feeling that the events portrayed share a deeper connection, contribute to a more coherent narrative than they actually do. Snake walking through the tunnel is to do with an outbreak of vocal parasites on the base. A wounded Quiet being carried away is because she tried to retrieve one of the kids' necklaces. Snake appearing to shoot the kids is part of a completely unrelated client job. Paz's appearance is a hallucination. The soldiers fighting triggers when you run out of GMP on a mission. Perhaps ironically, for the series' least complex narrative to date, it also lacks any rhyme or reason. As a result of this non-linear style of storytelling in which necessary context is buried under hours of what essentially acts as an encyclopedia, things just kind of happen in the Phantom Pain. You'll hear brief mention of some sniper, for example, before almost immediately fighting Quiet, then take her back to the base where after a certain amount of time she'll fight for you. Or you'll complete a main op, then get told to head back to base to see Eli be a dick for a bit, before heading back out into the field to select another item from the checklist. Or, at a seemingly arbitrary point in the story, you'll be told exactly where Skullface is so you can deal with him before returning and having things just carry on. In Kojima's attempts to ground the narrative so he could more believably tackle darker themes, he just ends up drawing further attention to the kind of uncanny weirdness that still exists in the game, while also removing any self-aware humour or spectacle from proceedings that would in part help justify it. Nothing ever reaches the explosive heights of Vamp fighting Raiden in 4, or when Solidus takes on multiple Rays in 2. Things plod along very slowly and not much is said. Every scene in older games was given enough context, was enough of a spectacle that suspending your disbelief was easy. You focused on the bigger picture. Here, the more realistic approach just makes the less realistic elements stick out like a sore thumb, and as a result, your focus is drawn to the ways in which these elements don't work. At the end of the day, as much as the game wishes to emphasize player expression to get you telling stories of your capers from the field, even if you do choose to go against the game's dominant strategy and utilize every tool at your disposal, your story can only ever really amount to a successful stealth encounter, or a series of explosions and gunshots, no matter how carefully you plan them. What previous games allowed for through careful pacing and authorial structuring was for these explosions and gunshots to truly mean something. The fish and mailed scene in Sons of Liberty takes you entirely by surprise because it completely subverts the expectations the game has set up for you up to that point. What was once a game that rewarded stealth and cleanliness suddenly turns into an absolute bloodbath, illustrating your character's transformation from Raiden to Jack the Ripper, as well as foregrounding the interface to remind you that as a player, you are merely part of a construct. This careful crafting allowed for an action-packed scene that also tells you a lot about the character and the nature of player control. It's moments like this that have so drawn people to the series over the years. There's method to that madness, no matter how inelegant Kojima's writing may seem at times. But it doesn't even have to be as complicated as that. As I mentioned in the last video, little moments like Snake looking at the beehive in 3 or the oil drum in 4 and cracking a wry smirk tell you so much about the character. He's not incapable of having fun with his prey, despite how grim the surrounding situation may seem. He's not some gruff, silent type. He has his moments, but he also has his moments where he can laugh, love, and pontificate on the nature of existence. He has all the weird, conflicting traits of a human being, just like all the other cast members. Otacon with his passion for anime and penchant for falling in love with people he really shouldn't be falling in love with, or Meryl's feelings for Snake and her familial connection to the Colonel, conflicting with her desire to be respected as a soldier. These characters deal with emotions outside of the conflict. They are more than what the mission demands from them. By comparison, Metal Gear Solid 5's characters are one note at best and wildly inconsistent at worst, leading to a scenario where you're spending a whole bunch of hours watching some assholes on an oil rig do some uninteresting things. Where Snake could communicate a surprising amount with as little as a smirk in the older games, Snake here doesn't really say or do anything. What's that? You're on a car ride with the man who destroyed your base and sent you into a coma for 9 years? Silence, blank expression. You're running away from a giant mech or being approached by a goddamn man on fire? Silence, blank expression. You've been forced to kill your own men in one of the few emotionally complicated scenes in the game, shooting down the troops you've recruited throughout your playtime as you slowly realize none of these people can be rescued, and what's more, they know and accept this despite the parasites screaming at them to do otherwise. Some stilted dialogue, but you know your boy's got that blank expression on lock. And don't get me wrong here, Snake has his reasons for being aloof, namely that he's not actually the legend we thought we were inhabiting, which we'll get onto soon. Given how much of this game is visibly unfinished, however, when you're spending an entire game watching scenes play out that really should warrant some kind of response, a facial twitch, anything, and Snake just stares blankly, it's hard not to speculate that Snake's character was yet another casualty of limited resources. Or rather, I would say that was the case if it weren't for the fact that poor characterization seemingly occurs across the board. Quiet frolicking with Snake in the rain holds none of the charm of Solid Snake and Meryl's relationship, or the obvious sexual tension between Big Boss and Eva, because it feels entirely unearned. Why does Quiet feel the way she does about Snake? Because he didn't kill her? Because he took her out on a few missions and built the bond level? He still bore witness to Big Boss setting her on fire and Ocelot and Kaz torturing her. He still oversaw her imprisonment, which itself makes very little sense given her ability to seemingly magic her way out of handcuffs and the like, and we're just supposed to believe there's some budding romance there between the two? Those scenarios in previous games were built up over the course of multiple hours. Like seemingly every other event in the Phantom Pain, Quiet and Snake just seems to happen. On top of that, much like the Code Talker vocal parasite debacle, her reason for not just communicating through other methods is relegated to the tapes, and the grand reveal is, Ocelot doesn't know. As he puts it, maybe she's just stubborn. Kaz, for all that his performance from Robin Downs is respectable given what the dude was working with, is entirely driven by revenge to the point that his bitterness makes him entirely unlikable. He just serves as a reminder to do your job. He'll preach about the need to protect child soldiers at all costs, while also hating and kind of being a dick to those child soldiers at the same time. Code Talker exists to attempt to explain away the plot holes caused by the daft vocal parasite narrative and not much else. He's brought in a few missions from the end of Chapter 1, and then in Chapter 2 seems to do very little. Huey seems to be a totally irredeemable arsehole for no reason, completely undercutting the gravity of the quarantine scene by shouting at you for killing men who themselves understand it is quite literally the only option. And given where Huey's arc goes, it had me wondering if he'd ever heard the phrase pricks in glass houses. Eli, Psycho Mantis, and Volgin seem to be included purely for fan service, with 2 of the 3 saying literally nothing, and the other being such a legitimate liability as to make you wonder why they keep him around at all. I guess you could argue that the Phantom Pain's characters highlight the dangers of allowing oneself to become singularly consumed by revenge, but this is far from the first time the series has touched on that theme and done it justice, making this attempt seem all the poorer by comparison. It really says a lot that Ocelot, perhaps the character most complained about by fans for the absolute neutering he received in comparison to previous appearances, still ended up feeling like the most fun-spirited character in the entire Mother Base crew. For all of his monotonous info dump dialogue, there were sections where he acted as the devil on your shoulder to rival Kaz's straight-laced angel, snarkily suggesting that you, for example, extract that weird parasite-ridden sniper despite the obvious risks she poses to you and your base. Or, I mean, sure, you could be sensible and run away from the skulls, or how about trying out that big missile launcher you've got on your back? You'd only be causing chaos blowing these things up and pissing off the client for the sake of self-defense, right? These moments with Ocelot ended up lending at least some kind of dry, black humour to proceedings, as you imagine Kaz in the corner angrily throwing his hat to the ground and going, "Oh nerds, he's done it again." If anything, Ocelot's character is about as close as the story gets to lining up with the game's attempt to heighten player expression. Ocelot is the only one saying, "Go on, take that risk, it could be interesting at the very least." To reiterate, the guy whose job it is to inform you about plants in the open world is the least boring character in your crew. What truly stings about the characterization here, however, is the fact that some elements had the potential for greatness, but again were let down by poor writing compounded by the game's structure. Skullface, for example, could have been remembered as one of the great Metal Gear villains, up there with Ocelot and Solidus. His wacky name fits with the say-it-as-you-see-it canon of Kojima naming conventions. His face looks kinda like a skull, I guess. His well-spoken demeanour is unsettlingly charming, but it all hides a deeply tragic past that, similar to Psycho Mantis in the first game, attempts to at least contextualise the extremes to which he goes. You can understand why someone who had been through all of that torture, who had their entire identity stripped away on every level for reasons entirely out with their control, only to later live their life in the shadow of someone else cleaning up their mess, would harbour such vengeful impulses. Skullface, for all he wears a literal burglar mask as if to say, I am a cartoon villain, is a rich, layered character in the same way the best villains in the series are. And yet, the game does nothing with him. He randomly appears when you get the missile launcher, he randomly appears when you get Huey, he randomly appears when you try to rescue that kid, and in each case, he tells you you're going to die and then goes away. No reason for him being there, no gradual build-up of information to have you figure out his motives, just a bunch of encounters, then Ocelot tells you he's in Afghanistan, he gives you one of the most awkward exposition dumps ever, and then you dismember the fucker. And that's it for Skullface. Again, his backstory is all in the game, it's just dumped on you in the form of tapes. No context, no pacing, just listen to the tapes you're given when you feel like. Like, did you know this dude killed Stalin? You know, the Joseph Stalin. You wouldn't unless you chose to listen to Skullface's Origins and XOF within Skullface's Objective number 5 and happened to catch Ocelot make brief mention of it. Consider Psycho Mantis in the first game by comparison. He bragged of his abilities, he made a show of it. His power extended outside of the story and affected you as a player. The careful use of silence and then the eerie music, as well as suddenly being tasked with subduing a possessed Meryl, who not only makes Snake fear for her safety, but makes him uncomfortable at the feelings she reveals, all before the boss battle has even begun. There's an ebb and flow to this encounter in service of hammering home just how ubiquitous this character's power is, and why you should consider them a threat. With Skullface, it's all just explained to you after the fact, in the same way the Beauty and Beasts were explained to you by Drebin in 4, and it's about as effective. But guys, it doesn't matter that we didn't get to see much of Skullface, because Big Boss, Venom Snake is basically the same as Skullface anyway. We're all victims of the cyclical nature of revenge after all. It's weak as hell, and a character potentially that rich deserved better. There is, however, one character I did like. A character that truly did say more with less. One with layers and consistency. And it's the camera. Okay, daft framing for this section aside, if there's one thing the Phantom Pain gets right, it's that it emphasises Kojima's continued flair for visual storytelling, if absolutely not written storytelling. Kojima's cinematography has always been one of the series' strengths, but the way the camera follows the action, flowing seamlessly between the shaky cam of cutscenes and player control, helps to turn the camera almost into a character in itself. In almost all cases, it sees what we see. It's reactive to the action rather than predictive. Something happens, the camera follows, oftentimes not giving us a full picture of a scenario to evoke tension, as for example, a dumbfounded Snake stares up at a towering mech, only for the camera to shakily crane its neck in a similar fashion. Every movement feels so natural, so designed to both guide your focus and track where it would likely go, that you don't even notice when cuts are made to some truly majestically framed shots. Seriously, the camera work in the Phantom Pain is great, setting a new standard for the series and arguably going above and beyond most other games. But where it really came alive for me was the twist. That moment where Kaz is fretting over a comatose Big Boss, and the camera fights to get a glimpse in between the hustle and bustle of medical professionals. That is until the veneer is smashed in what feels like typical Kojima fashion. The shaky cam we've grown to take for granted pulls back as Kaz looks over our way and utters, "What about him?" It's legitimately a really clever use of perspective. Suddenly we are the camera, looking at someone who isn't us, who we thought we were, leaving us asking, who the fuck are we? The first time I played the game, I'd heard mutterings that we weren't actually going to be controlling Big Boss, but I didn't really pay it too much heed. Apparently to the point that I didn't realise that all that great perspective shifting stuff that preceded the reveal was literally shown in the trailer. God damn it, Kojima! After playing the game for tens of hours over a condensed period of time, this revelation alone had me with my head in my hands, internally screaming, he's done it, he's done the Metal Gear Solid 2 thing again. Playing through that opening mission again, with Snake pulling the photos back to reveal my dumbass, realising that Ishmael was in fact the legendary Big Boss I thought I was the entire game, seeing the other side of that ambulance scene with Big Boss triumphantly exiting on a motorcycle, it was a fairly exhilarating experience at the time. Combined with the talk of how Solid Snake actually killed Venom Snake in the very first Metal Gear, and the MSX console causing time to jump forward, we seemingly had all the requisite Kojima-isms to launch this moment into the canon of great Metal Gear Solid moments. That missing link that was talked about in the trailers, that we'd finally get closure on how Big Boss became the villain of the series, was explored in a far subtler way than he killed some children as the trailers seemed to suggest. No, despite subverting our expectations in terms of the child soldiers, Kojima still manages to give us the answer. Big Boss isn't a villain, but he sure as hell isn't a hero either. His intentions are pure, but his methods, namely completely changing someone's life, robbing them of any semblance of their identity and placing them on the world stage to face the masses of people who want him dead, certainly are not. The questionable nature of his actions is brought to the fore entirely in retrospect, through his absence, through examining what you've gone through to get to that point, and ultimately how little it means. Big Boss manipulates people, turns friends and fellow soldiers against him, all to maintain his image. Whether or not it serves a greater purpose as Big Boss sees it matters not. These consequences do not reflect the actions of a heroic individual. It forces you to rethink what Snake's been through the entire game. For example, the conclusion of Snake's hallucination arc with Paz, perhaps the only other truly great story beat I can point to in the game outside of the quarantine scene, becomes even more fucked up when you find out the truth about his identity. The layers of regret at play here are compounded when you realise he's carrying someone else's guilt, stuck in a past that isn't his. It's the closest he comes to any kind of closure on the events of Ground Zeroes, but ultimately it means nothing. It's as transient as a butterfly lilting on the wind. Big Boss has shifted that guilt and that responsibility onto some unsuspecting schmuck. More importantly, however, this twist forces you to re-examine your actions throughout the entire game as a player, and what the game has forced you to endure. I've seen talk of the fact that the twist happens for literally no reason, and I don't think that's necessarily true, even if the seemingly random appearance of Mission 46 might hint otherwise. But it isn't random, it happens when you've fully developed all of the facilities on Mother Base. At this stage, Big Boss can finally reveal his vision to you, because you've built a believable enough facsimile to take the heat off of him as he builds Outer Heaven. The more interesting story was happening elsewhere. Snake, and by extension you as a player, have spent an entire game playing a distraction, keeping a low profile during missions that don't matter while Big Boss does the real work. He emphasises how anyone can take on the mantle of the legend, but specifically sets up a patsy and an entire army of people around him to protect his obviously more important version of the legend. As much as the game congratulates you for your part in making the series what it is, it also highlights how futile your actions have been. It turns wasting your time into a legitimate story beat. Now, all of this talk might make you believe that I think the twist to be some masterwork of subversion on the part of Kojima. Let me be clear at this stage that I do not. I think it's perhaps a less dumb way of saying what Kojima wanted to say than having Big Boss murder some kids, I guess, and I don't think the twist happens for literally no reason. I also think that's perhaps the lowest bar you could possibly set for the conclusion of your narrative, of your entire franchise. So yeah, as time has gone on, I've become less and less a fan of a twist which sees you replaying an entire mission, tutorial prompts and all, to say something I'm not sure needed to be said. Just as previous games exemplified that we didn't need an open world Metal Gear to highlight player expression, they also already tell this story. It's just that older games didn't require the player to endure a further 30 to 40 hours of a dull plot filled with dull characters to get there. Big Boss at most was perhaps a jaded, bitter asshole who manipulated the will of others to his advantage, but he was surrounded and driven by other jaded, bitter arseholes. We knew this the moment he shook the president's hand in Snake Eater. It's why 3's ending works so well. That whole game is designed to make you question the notion of loyalty, patriotism, the idea that just because you're fighting for the good old US of A doesn't make you the good guys. Turning one's back on their country is surely an act unbecoming of a soldier, but Big Boss only did it because his country did the same thing to him in forcing him to kill the boss. It's not some gotcha twist moment. It's subtle, it's built up, the natural answer to a question being asked the entire game. Peace Walker illustrated his decline into outward paranoia as the world attempts to take him down and he resorts to more questionable actions to maintain his liberty. Even then though, there's a conceivable logic to his actions, and it's clear that the motives are pure even if the ends don't necessarily justify those means. Hell, Big Boss fucking explains this when he kills Zero in 4. These people didn't have villainous intentions, they were perhaps just stubborn. While my hype-addled brain might not have recognised it at the time, championing this twist as the second coming of 2's Raiden reveal, this story absolutely did not need to be told because it already had been told. Multiple times. Needless to say, when it was revealed that this really was it for the Phantom Pain, fans became voracious, desperately clawing at any morsel they could find to complete the saga. They couldn't accept that it could just end like this, so around the time its concept and unfinished cutscenes were released as part of the game's collector's edition, Mission 51, or
Kingdom
of the Flies, gave people something to point at and say, see, the game wasn't finished, there was still more story to tell. It's at the point where demands are still being made to this day for Konami to ditch the cosmetic DLC released for Metal Gear Online and instead give fans the substantive conclusion they deserve to complete the game. But honestly, any such demands, any thought that this lone mission could give fans the closure they desire, scream of wishful thinking. See, Mission 51 gives us no insight into Big Boss's actions or headspace after the truth comes out. We're still inhabiting Venom as he attempts to recover Sahelanthropus following Eli's uprising. As far as the plot is concerned, even though we've just had this bombshell dropped on us regarding the identity of who we've been controlling this whole time, it's just another day at Diamond Dogs. More importantly though, like the question of how did Big Boss become a villain, all Mission 51 serves to answer is what happened to Sahelanthropus when Eli took it? Which, granted, is a question that kinda needed to be answered, but in doing so we ignore the far more pressing issue. Why did that need to be asked in the first place? We find out where Eli ended up, but we're left wondering why he needed to go there, why the uprising even happened, out of a youthful rebellious streak? His tendency to cause trouble was well established when he escaped his handlers to form a group of child soldiers, or when Snake had to break his arm upon returning to Mother Base, or when Ocelot had to fight him to stop him slicing a soldier's throat, or when he challenged you to a fight in a side-op for next to no reason, or when he rigged pipes to kill one of his fellow kids. We know this, so we then need to examine what him stealing Sahelanthropus actually says outside of that, which is, upon inspection, not a whole lot. And what does it say when Snake secures Sahelanthropus? Also not a whole lot. It would have acted as one of the few story points in the entire game that Snake's horn-induced colorblindness comes into play, and I guess would allow sufficient room for Eli to go do whatever he has to do in order to get to the events of Metal Gear Solid, but I am absolutely certain that was not worth opening up plot points that weren't going to be closed. Once again, it's the answer to a question that didn't need to be asked, somehow both needlessly convoluted and disappointingly mundane. The cut content of Mission 51 would not have left you satisfied were it just in the game to begin with. It acts as a culmination of sorts of all the story's problems, a full stop to cement just how structural its problems are, and how no conclusion, however definitive, could ever fill that void as a result. It's Kojima attempting to write himself out of yet another self-imposed hole, just like the tapes acted as a means of acknowledging every other hole in the story. It just seems like at every step of the way, Kojima's ambitions for this story that at once deified Big Boss while asserting the fragile concept of heroism consistently outweighed the resources available to him to realise it. He seems to have picked the path of most resistance, choosing to push Big Boss's likely more interesting story to one side, a story featuring a more vibrant character which could easily be justified as "I've set up a distraction," in favour of trying to characterise that distraction, with all the nonsensical explanations involving hypnosis and plastic surgery that necessarily have to go along with that. And what we're left with is a twist which tells us nothing we didn't already know, ending a story that's clearly unfinished that could never have satisfied players anyway, even if it was. You know what though? As I come to the end of this analysis, I'm finding myself more and more thinking that I get it. This piece is far and away the most difficult thing I have ever undertaken in my 2 years writing for the channel. It's taken several drafts, edits, and scrapped ideas to fully formulate my thoughts on where I think this game goes wrong. And even at this point, months on and unable to bear thinking about this game anymore, I still don't think I could ever completely illustrate what I see to be its shortcomings. I present it to you in its almost certainly imperfect state, because at some stage I just have to get it out of my life. It'll never be perfect, it might not even be good enough. A lot of people probably won't like it because I've focused on the wrong things, or I'll have repeated myself, or it might not be as coherent as people would like it to be. People might watch this and think, why did this piece need to exist 2 years on and covering talking points others have already touched upon? In short, making stuff is hard, and if I'm feeling this way about a relatively insignificant video, I can only imagine extending this entire thought process to a game this colossal, a piece of software that consumed years of people's lives under really shitty conditions to produce. Said conditions at Konami seem to suggest that the fact we got a game as expansive and mechanically tight as we did, despite the problems I have with its design and story, is kind of a miracle. I am absolutely ready to catapult this game out of my life forever, but I'm still immensely intrigued by what Kojima has planned next. That trailer for Death Stranding shown at the Game Awards was initially one of the wildest, least coherent things I have ever seen, and yet interviews given since do a really good job of contextualizing almost everything going on within it. He takes this massively disparate series of events and somehow manages to tie it all together. It makes me think that Kojima still has vision and drive to do something truly innovative and hell, perhaps even revolutionary, pointing more and more to the fact that, for all of its flaws, Metal Gear Solid 5 was an unfortunate product of its environment above all else. Whew, and with that, I feel like a weight has been lifted. As I say, this is easily the most difficult thing I've undertaken for this channel, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed it, but I can also totally understand if you didn't. If you did, and you want to keep abreast of channel happenings, including my Game of the Year video that will be coming sooner than you think, you can always hit subscribe, click the little bell thingy, and check out the podcast in the description. If you feel like going the extra mile, however, you can always support me directly via Patreon, like these wonderful folks currently on screen. Your support allows me to take on weird and wacky projects like this and dedicate the time needed to make them as worthwhile as I possibly can. For that, I really cannot thank you enough. In particular, I'd like to thank Mark B. Writing, Artyom Vitsyuk, Spike Jones, Vasily Hrabinka, Leonardo Paley, Harry Fuertes, Ham Migas, Travis Bennett, Julian McRoth, Zach Casserly, Samuel Pickens, Nico Blakely, Tom Nash, Shardfire, Philip Lange, Rob, Rusty Shackelford, Mosh, Anna Pimentel, Jesse Ryan, Brandon Robinson, Diego Foxo Booza, Justin's Holderness, Biggie Smith, Peter, Christian Kuhneman, Camel Traffic, Nicholas Ross, and Charlie Yang. And with that, I'm Hamish Black, and this has been Writing on Games. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.